Welcome, everyone. Today, we're taking a deep dive into nutrition. More specifically, we're going to talk about how sugar impacts your health. And for this conversation, we have the honor of having with us Dr. Robert Lustig. Not only is Dr. Lustig a professor and prominent endocrinologist at the University of California in San Francisco, he is also the very well-known author of multiple New York Times best-selling books, some of which you may have heard of or read, like Fat Chance and Metabolical. He is also, and lucky for us, a very vocal public health advocate. Dr. Lustig has gained global attention through his research and public talks on the effects of sugar and processed foods on metabolic health. Welcome, Dr. Lustig, and it is truly an honor to have you here with us today to share your knowledge and insights.
My pleasure, Christine.
I have to make a confession that my favorite of your books is The Hacking of the American Mind,
My
because
favorite too.
you very skillfully combined many facets of what we consumers are facing, and it's truly an eye-opener, so many different levels. I wanted to ask you, what drives you to do what you do with such zest and enthusiasm? Because to me, it looks like this battle is like between David and Goliath. You must have an inner force that motivates you and keeps you going.
Well, that's a good question. What I can say is I did not come to this with an agenda. Really had no interest in being a public figure, and I had no interest in speaking out. My job was to be the best academic pediatric endocrinologist I could and basically keep my head down and stay out of the limelight and just publish papers. Unfortunately for me, the data took me in a completely different direction because what the data said was that the general concepts that science and society were operating off of were incorrect. That basically we were, going down the wrong rabbit hole. And, once I saw the data, it was like, swallowing the red pill from the Matrix. And so I started publishing and explaining to the public, you know, I think we've got it wrong. And that got a lot of people angry. And then I came to realize that the reason it got people angry was not because it was wrong, but because there was money involved. And that got me, starting to look at the dark underbelly of, corporate America and society. And, here I am now.
Right, very fondly about your mom and the hacking of the American mind. And you mentioned she's an inspiration for the book. I'm
Well, she
curious, what was about her life that inspired you to write the book?
she was an inspiration, but in fact, she was a negative inspiration. I wrote the book in part because I was trying to figure out why my mom was my mom. And she was a very unhappy person. And, she made me a kind of unhappy person. And, part of the reason for the book was my quest to sort of understand my mother's own unhappiness. And she spent most of her life trying to manage or, obviate her pain and her unhappiness. And she did it with a lot of dopaminergic substances and behaviors. And so I came to the understanding of what addiction was really about. And basically, it's a distraction from your own pain and your own sadness. And, when you realize that, then the question is, oh, how do you get happy? And the answer is not through anything you buy. And, you know, and there was a book.
Yeah, you do a great job of just sort of diving in and defining so many different aspects of what really controls all of those emotions. I want
Mhm.
to talk more about that, but before we go there, I wanted to comment on something that I found particularly interesting about your background, and that is that after getting your bachelor's degree from MIT and your medical degree from Cornell,
Mhm.
you decided that you needed a little bit more. And to understand the laws surrounding public health, you decided to go to law school and got your master's of studies in law. What triggered that? Was that triggered by the battle with the food industry and the complexity behind everything that we face?
Yeah. So in 2007, I gave the first talk that said sugar was a problem. Up to that point, I was focused on obesity and insulin being the problem driving the weight gain. And then the question was, well, okay, if insulin's driving the weight gain, what's driving the insulin? And I gave a talk at the NIH in 2007, beginning of 2007. They were having a 100th anniversary gala symposium on public health and environmental disruptors. So it was a 2-day symposium. The first day was on successes like lead poisoning and pollution and asthma. And the second day was going to be about challenges. So the morning was going to be about obesity and metabolic syndrome, and the afternoon was going to be about ADD and autism. And so they asked me to give a talk on what did I think was the biggest environmental contributor to obesity and diabetes. And that was my charge. I had a half hour. And so I sat down to try to prepare the talk, and I'm sure that they thought I was going to pick some chemical in the environment like BPA or phthalates or PFAS or something, that was identifiable as, an environmental chemical, an endocrine disruptor. And I said, yeah, maybe, but, there's something bigger going on here. And I said to myself, oh, look, I'm a pediatrician. Children today are getting diseases they never got before. Type 2 diabetes and fatty liver disease were diseases that were unheard of in children. And now 25% of kids, not just obese kids, but kids have fatty liver disease. And, 1/3 of all new diabetes diagnoses in children are type 2. And this was unheard of when I was a resident. It's happened on my watch. What could explain it? What could kids be exposed to that could account for this? So it was diabetes and fatty liver disease, diabetes and fatty liver disease. So I said, well, wait a second. Those two diseases are the diseases of alcohol. And I know that, taking care of enough alcoholics, when I was a med student, you didn't see fatty liver disease in anyone unless they were an alcoholic. But now kids don't drink alcohol. So is there something that they are exposed to that looks like alcohol? And so I opened up my biochemistry text from 30 some odd years earlier, and I went to the alcohol page. Okay, there's the metabolism of alcohol. And then I turned the page. And there was the metabolism of fructose, the sweet molecule in sugar. And I went, whoa, yeah, huh, that's weird. Huh. Let me start comparing these. And I started looking at the similarities and the differences between the metabolism of alcohol and the metabolism of fructose. And what I came to realize was they're exactly the same. They're exactly the same. The biochemical
Wow.
metabolism of fructose is tantamount to that of alcohol. And so I realized, wait a second, fructose is the alcohol of the child. The big difference between the two is that for alcohol, the yeast does the first step called glycolysis. For fructose, we do our own first step. But after that, they're exactly the same. There's no difference. And so it makes perfect sense then that children would get the diseases of alcohol without alcohol. And so I put together this talk and said this, to the NIH. And it was a symposium. And so I gave my talk and I got applause. And then it was the bathroom break. And I'm standing there at the podium answering questions, and people aren't coming back. And then I realized I had to go to the bathroom. So I went to the bathroom, and there are 40 toxicologists in the bathroom. And I walk in the door, and they friggin' tackle me. Okay, and they won't let me out of the bathroom,
Oh my
screaming
gosh.
at me, "Oh my God, oh my God, he's right, he's right. You have to tell the whole world about this."
Oh my.
And I guess I've been doing that ever since. So,
Well,
you
we're
know,
very happy you're telling the whole world about this
if I
because
can get
this is
40 toxicologists into a blazing lather, something's got to be amiss. So, and the fact of the matter is, once I said that, people started looking at this issue a lot more closely and started doing their own studies. And I have to say that, in the last 15 years, since 2000, 7, 8, all the data has basically shown that, this is the primary driver of obesity, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, cancer, dementia, polycystic ovarian disease,
Ugh.
because all of these diseases are mitochondrial diseases. These are the diseases of defective mitochondria. And it turns out fructose F's up your mitochondria.
So I want to take a step back because I want to make sure that all of our listeners understand what we're saying. Because I find that it's not about your level of education. It's really about whether you've ever paid any attention to this. And when you do, then you can understand it better. So you refer to sugar as a compound containing two molecules, one of glucose and one of fructose, if I understand correctly. So the glucose is the one that gives energy to our muscles, our brains, etc. And then this fructose molecule is the one that produces some energy, but also fats. And
It
those are the two.
it it doesn't produce energy.
Okay.
And
Okay.
that's part of the conundrum. So it depends on how you define energy. If we're talking about physical energy, that is heat, that is if you blow it up in a bomb calorimeter, oh, then it gives energy. It gives 4 calories per gram. But if you put it into a cell and expect the cell to turn the fructose into energy, then it doesn't. It actually saps energy. And the reason is because we are not bomb calorimeters. We don't run on heat. We run on ATP, adenosine triphosphate. That is the chemical that holds the energy in the cell that the cell accesses to perform all of its metabolic functions to power the cell is ATP. And if you don't generate ATP, you're not generating energy. And it turns out that fructose actually inhibits ATP generation. So
Hmm.
if you blow it up in a calorimeter, it's energy. If you put it in a cell, it saps energy. And understanding the difference is sort of tantamount to understanding the concept of metabolic health and how it is so different from this concept of calories. And that is why my hashtag is kill the calorie.
Yes. And so you say, don't look at calories, don't count calories, because in the long term, that doesn't work.
Right.
And I
If
know
you
you've
counted
spoken.
ATP, that would work, but that's hard to do. But that would at least be the marker of metabolic health is ATP generation. Calories is not.
So I was doing a little bit of research on this and I got very intrigued with this idea of what is sugar. So I started to very carefully read various food labels to see if I could identify what ingredient might be that sugar type sweet ingredient. And I have to say it was quite confusing. So, for example, I went to my local health food store and I picked up random items and I read the ingredients looking for what I thought might be the sweet ingredients. I don't know if we can call them all sugar. I need your help on that. But let me just share. This is what I found. Pure cane sugar, organic sugar, brown sugar, alcohol sugar, and that one I was particularly mind-boggling because it was in a cookie,
Mhm.
monk fruit sugar, fructose, high corn syrup fructose, organic cane sugar, invert cane syrup, rice
Yep.
syrup solids, agave syrup, brown rice syrup, honey, and maple syrup. Are all these things the same and are they processed and metabolized the same?
So the short answer is they are all the same, except they're made differently. They might be
Mm,
made from different sources, but ultimately they are all the same. In fact, you mentioned probably about 20 just now.
mm.
There are 262 names for sugar, and you can find them on my website, robertlustig.com. under sugar
Mhm.
repository. It's a heading. And they're listed in my colleague Wolfram Alderson's Hypoglycemia Support Foundation website as well. So if you just go to hypoglycemia.org, you can find all 262 names for sugar. And we're actually adding to it all the time. It's a living project that we are doing with HSF. So the bottom line is the food industry uses all of those. And the reason is because when they use different ones, they can list them as number 5, number 6, number 7, number 8, number 9 on the nutrition facts label. But when you add them up, it's number 1. So they are hiding the sugar in plain sight. And they use different names for sugar that you don't know are sugar. Like, for instance, invert cane syrup. How would you know that that was sugar? Demerara, panocha, okay, apple puree. Sounds like that's apple. No, that's sugar. It's really evaporated cane juice is another one that they use in yogurt a lot. So these are all subterfuges by the food industry specifically to hide the sugar in plain sight. And the reason I know that is because our clinic coordinator for a year and a half actually worked at General Mills and attended those meetings like where are we going to hide the sugar in this product. So this is a well worn, well thought out strategy on the part of the industry.
It was particularly mind-boggling to read alcohol sugar. What is that?
Well, probably alcohol sugar is really sugar alcohol is more likely. And maybe they,
Mm.
switched it up to confuse you even more. But, sugar alcohols are like sorbitol, mannitol, xylitol, erythritol. So they are sugar alcohols. They have some caloric value. They are somewhat sweet. They're not very sweet. You have to put more in order to get more sweetness. They're bulk though, so they can do things, that help in a bulking fashion, like a cookie, because it takes up space. It holds on to water, which is actually a problem. So it's good for water activity to keep something moist, but it's bad because when you consume it, it doesn't get fully digested, and so it holds on to water, and so it can create a fair amount of bloating and diarrhea. And the more sugar alcohol in a product, the more diarrhea and the more GI distress. So it is by no means a good answer for, substituting sugar. But without question, the fructose molecule is the really bad guy in the story. And the reason is because the fructose molecule is metabolized completely differently from the glucose molecule. The glucose molecule goes to carbon dioxide and ATP. The fructose molecule goes to fat. And so they are handled by the liver differently. They are handled by muscle differently. And they're the reason why we have fatty liver disease. They're the reason for the fat in the muscle. They're the reason for insulin resistance, the liver fat and the muscle fat. So that's what drives the chronic metabolic disease. Now, glucose is not perfect. Glucose generates an insulin response, and an insulin response can generate weight gain, but it's usually subcutaneous fat, which is where your body wants to put the energy. It does not want to put the energy in the liver. It wants to put the energy in your spare tire around your middle. Now,
Mm.
now, do you want the spare tire? No, but you know, from a health standpoint, okay, having a spare tire is a whole lot better than having a fatty liver.
So just to clarify, things that contain glucose are things like grains and nuts and vegetables and starchy foods.
Yeah, bread, rice, pasta, potatoes.
And things that contain the fructose are things like honey, maple syrup, fast foods,
Uh, so,
processed foods.
so there are 5 caloric sweeteners that contain fructose: sucrose, table sugar; high fructose corn syrup; maple syrup; honey; agave.
Mm.
And for lack of a better word, those are all basically equivalent. Okay, they all have glucose and fructose. So the glucose is not the problem, but the fructose is. The glucose is the energy of life. Every cell on the planet can burn glucose for energy. Glucose is so important that if you don't consume it, your body makes it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Fructose, on the other hand, there is not one biochemical reaction in any animal cell on the planet that requires dietary fructose. It is completely vestigial to all animal life. It is a holdover from our plant ancestors. It's why they're plants and we're not. And, they muck up mitochondrial function. Now, why do they muck up mitochondrial function? That's a very good question. That's an extremely good question. And the answer is because each cell in your body has to burn and it has to grow, but not at the same time. Each cell
Mm-hmm.
in your body at one point in its life had to grow, and then at another point in its life, it had to burn. Now, imagine the fructose is wood. Okay. You have a house and you have wood. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You can use each stick of wood for one of two purposes. You can use it for firewood or you can use it for furniture, but you can't use it for both. Each stick of wood can be used for one or the other, but not both. Well, each molecule of glucose can be used to burn to ATP and carbon dioxide, or it can be used for structural components like lipids for membranes to
Mm-hmm.
allow cells to divide, or it can be used for amino acids, okay, or it can be used for ribose to make new DNA. In fact, if you burn all the way to carbon dioxide, then you can't use the glucose for structure. You can only use it for energy. So there has to be a way to shut off the mitochondria in order to allow for growth in those times when you need growth. And there are two kinds of cells that need growth big time. One is cancer cells, and the other is fetal cells. And cancer cells and fetal cells have two things in common: no oxygen and no mitochondria.
Mm-hmm.
No oxygen, no mitochondria. This is a phenomenon called the Warburg effect, uh, discovered by Otto Warburg, won the Nobel Prize in 1931 for discovering that cancer cells don't need oxygen to grow. They ferment sugar. They don't burn sugar. They ferment it, okay, like yeast. And they get some ATP out of it to power those cells. But ultimately, they use the glucose for growth. Well, fetal cells do the same thing. And so when your cell is in growth mode, you don't want your mitochondria to work. So you have to have a way to stop them. Fructose is the way to stop them. So fructose puts your cell into growth mode instead of burning mode because it basically inhibits your mitochondria. So cancer cells don't have mitochondria, fetal cells don't have mitochondria, but your regular cells do have mitochondria, but you have a way of putting the mitochondria to sleep, and it's called fructose. And the reason we think is because there's only one time there were in ancient times there was only one time a year when fructose was available. It was harvest time. And what came after harvest time? Winter. And so evolutionarily, it made sense that fructose would actually tell your mitochondria, hey, stop burning, start storing, because winter's coming and we got a 4-month famine coming and we need to lay down more fat. And the last thing in the world we want to be doing right now is burning. So let's
Mm-hmm.
shut down our mitochondria specifically to generate that fat so we can survive all the way to spring. How about that? So there's actually an ecological imperative to why fructose does this. And if we were all hibernating all winter, that would make sense. but we don't. We are, 24/7, 365. So shutting down your mitochondria, when it's not harvest time is the problem. And, sugar is available 24/7, 365, and it's available in every food, every processed food on purpose because it's also addictive. It
Yeah.
basically activates the reward center of your brain to say, this feels good. I want more. So you eat more. And it keeps going and going and going. And now you've got your obesity and metabolic syndrome.
So, that leads me to, and I want to come back to something that you said earlier, but when I think of metabolic function, one of the things that immediately comes to my mind is hormones. So, the sugar has this impact on hormones that are controlling our ability to say, I'm hungry, not hungry. Yes?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So there's a hunger hormone in your stomach called ghrelin. So
Hmm.
ghrelin is made by the cells in your stomach. Ghrelin goes into the bloodstream, goes to your brain. Brain says, hey, ghrelin levels are high. That means my stomach's empty. Therefore, I am hungry. I'm going to go find some food to eat. So when your ghrelin levels go up, that's a signal for hunger and to eat. Then you put food in your stomach, ghrelin levels go down. And that says, hey, I'm not hungry anymore. I just ate. Well, fructose does not suppress ghrelin.
Hmm.
Glucose does, but fructose doesn't. So you keep eating,
You keep eating.
as an example. All right. So these are very different molecules, this glucose, fructose. Now, the food industry will tell you calorie is a calorie, sugar is a sugar. It doesn't matter. And the reason is because every sugar burns at 4 calories per gram. And if we were bomb calorimeters, they would be right. But we are not. And this is how they basically assuage their culpability by basically, going back to calories. So
Right.
anytime you hear anyone say the word calorie, okay, they're either a fool or a liar. And so in my clinic, if you said the word calorie, I kicked you out because it meant you didn't understand.
So I have a question. I have friends that instead of adding sugar to their coffee, they add these artificial sweeteners, sucralose, stevia. I'm not sure if stevia is an artificial, whatever comes in those little pink,
Well,
white, and blue packets.
it's natural, but it's
And
non-nutritive. Yeah.
okay. And then I also have friends that say they drink soft drinks, but the so-called zero version of the drink, otherwise known as, the diet version.
Mhm.
What do we know about how these artificial sweeteners impact our metabolism? Is it in the same way as the fructose?
No, it's different. It's different.
Mm,
So these non-nutritive sweeteners, and some of them are artificial, some of them are natural.
hmm.
Stevia and monk fruit are natural. Erythritol is natural. Allulose is natural. Others, of course, are not natural, like neotame and aspartame and sucralose. Those are not natural. They have different impacts, but in general, what they do is they provide a sweetness to the tongue. Message goes tongue to brain. Sugar's coming because the brain doesn't know that it's not sugar. And so then a message goes brain to pancreas, release the insulin. And so you still get an
Mm.
insulin response. And if you get an insulin response, you're still going to drive energy into fat. So just because it didn't have calories doesn't mean it didn't drive an insulin response. That's the first thing. The second thing is that several of the sweeteners, not all, but several of them, have effects in the GI tract that are different. They seem to alter the microbiome. They seem to alter the tight junctions that hold the intestinal cells together, and they create what is known as leaky gut. And leaky gut allows for the
Mm.
passage of, you know, bad proteins, cytokines, lipopolysaccharides into the bloodstream to drive inflammation. And so those, that artificial sweeteners are associated with glucose intolerance and insulin resistance anyway, unrelated to calories and unrelated to fructose. So they're different, but they still cause problems. So a study came out a couple of years ago that the toxicity of one Coca-Cola equals the toxicity of two diet Coca-Colas. So half as bad. So half as bad does not mean good. Half as bad
Right.
means half as bad. And if you think that they're, well, no fructose, no calories, you might drink 10 of them, in which case then they're 5 times as bad.
Yeah. Yeah. I think actually that's the correlation. People drink more because they
Yeah.
think it's not bad. I wanted to ask you because you made a comment about the gastrointestinal impact and leaky gut. Is it related at all to Crohn's disease?
Well, interesting you should ask. There are a couple of papers that have just come out recently that look at Crohn's disease patients that have reduced their sugar intake and their symptoms have gotten better.
Hmm.
And actually, there are several autoimmune diseases where if you reduce the sugar, the severity of the disease gets better. Lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and several others. And so the question is, why would that be? Why would reducing the sugar in your diet play a role in the reduction in the severity of Crohn's disease? Well, Crohn's is an autoimmune disease, at the level of the GI tract. What we know, and this is complicated, but let me try to, you know, take you through it. The cells in your intestine are linked together. Okay, they present a barrier. And this barrier has three parts to it. It has a physical barrier, which is the mucin layer. It has a biochemical barrier, which are proteins that hold the cells together called tight junctions. And finally, there's an immunological barrier called Th17 cells, and these release a cytokine called IL-17. So that is the intestinal barrier, because the intestine, as you know, is a sewer. Okay. A sewer is a pipe with you know what in it. Well, that's what
Yeah.
your intestine is. It's a pipe with you know what in it. But it's supposed to allow for certain things to be able to be absorbed from the intestine. It's obviously a semi-permeable barrier. And those tight junctions are supposed to prevent bad stuff from getting into your bloodstream and keep the, junk in the intestinal lumen where it
Mhm.
belongs. Well, those tight junctions, one of them, for instance, is called zonulins, and zonulins are what go wrong in celiac disease. That they become
Yeah.
that they're dysfunctional in celiac disease. Well, it turns out those tight junctions need ATP to stay strong, to basically maintain the integrity of the intestine. Well, fructose, that pesky molecule we keep talking about, nitrates those tight junction proteins and renders them less effective. And so
Mm.
they, instead of being tight, they separate. When they separate, stuff can get through from the lumen
Mm.
into the bloodstream. And now you've got a phenomenon called leaky gut. And it's been shown because you can measure the cytokines, you can measure the endotoxins from the intestinal lumen in the bloodstream after a high sugar meal. And so we think that sugar is basically poisoning that intestine to allow for the junk to enter. And when the junk enters, that generates an increase in the immune response. And therefore, autoimmune diseases would get worse,
Such as Crohn's.
such as Crohn's.
Hmm.
So that's a
Interesting.
long way to explain it, but we think that this gut health issue is very important, and we think that fructose is a particular bad guy when it comes to um, gut health.
Hmm. So I want to ask you, I know people who are, instead of doing uh, calorie counting, they do intermittent fasting. And then I've heard of people turning to Ozempic, this well-marketed diabetes drug, which apparently helps with weight loss, to lose a couple of pounds. As
Yep.
an endocrinologist, what are your thoughts about this approach of like using Ozempic as a weight loss drug?
Well, so complicated. So let's start with the intermittent fasting first. Does intermittent fasting work?
Hmm.
The answer is Yes, for certain people. The question is, who are the certain people? Best we can tell, we think that the reason that intermittent fasting works is because it gives the liver a chance to burn off the fat that's accumulated. So it's intermittent fasting seems to be good for people with fatty liver disease and insulin resistance. So I'm for it, for the right patient. That's not going to help everybody
Mm.
because not everybody has fatty liver, but 45% of people do. So, you know, intermittent fasting's a potential way to deal with that. And it's pretty benign. And so if you can do it and it helps you, I'm for it. I'm not against it, that's for sure. All right, now, Ozempic and GLP-1 analogs in general. Complicated question. And I'm on record. I did a Wall Street Journal podcast on this a couple of months ago. I wear three hats, and how I feel about these analogs depends on which hat I'm wearing. So I have the clinician hat, I have the scientist hat, and I have the public health hat. So when I'm wearing my clinician hat, I'm glad they're here because they do work. I mean, there's no question that, a sizable proportion of people who, take these drugs lose weight.
Mhm.
And, that's good. And we have a lot of patients who need to lose weight for a whole bunch of different reasons, but, for diabetes amelioration, for, fatty liver disease, I mean, we were doing bariatric surgery before, and,
Yeah.
Ozempic is a lot cheaper and
Yeah.
potentially safer. Not clear yet. That's a big question. We'll get to that. But some people need it. And, as a clinician, it's my job to try to help people who need help. Now, from the scientist standpoint, I'm switching hats. The question is, why do they work? Well, they work in two places. The first place they work is here in the brain. Now, what do they do in the brain? They tell the reward center to calm down. Now, that sounds like a really good thing if you tell the reward center to calm down. In fact, they're using Ozempic for alcoholism. They're using Ozempic for other addictions because it's telling the reward center to calm down. And that might actually be a very good thing. On the other hand, it might be a very bad thing too, because rewards what gets you up in the morning. We have a history in endocrinology that is not that old. In 2006, there was a drug that was available in Europe, never got approved here in the United States. The drug was called Rimonabant. Trade name was Acomplia. And what it was it was an endocannabinoid antagonist. It was the anti-marijuana drug. It was the anti-munchies drug. Okay. It basically blocked where marijuana binds to your brain cells.
Mhm.
And it caused a significant amount of weight loss because it basically stopped you from eating. It was the anti-munchies drug. And people
Mhm.
lost a lot of weight. And it got approved by the European Food Safety Authority. And so it was on the market for 2 months. And what happened? Well, there were 21 suicides in 2 months on Rimonabant. Now, it turns out if you suppress the reward system so severely, you don't want to get up in the morning. You don't want to
Mm.
live. Rewards what, basically gets you out of bed. And if you basically, get rid of reward, you've gotten rid of, love for life. That's a problem. That's a little bit of a
Yeah.
problem. That's one issue. So we have to be very careful. Now, it has been shown that these GLP-1 analogs do increase rate of depression, but we haven't seen suicidal ideation or suicide yet. But we need to be mindful of that and aware. Now, the second place that these drugs work is on the intestine, on the alimentary tract. They decrease gastric emptying. They decrease how the stomach lets the food go through. All right. Now, that's part of why it works, is because if you're not moving the food through, you don't want to eat anymore because you kind of like, I don't want to put anything more in me. Okay. That sounds like a good thing until it's not. So, number one, it causes nausea and it causes vomiting, which is pretty much everybody who takes these drugs, at least for a while, until they get used
Mm.
to it. But it also causes pancreatitis and it also causes gastroparesis. Stomach turns to stone. 3.4% of people who take these GLP-1 analogs get gastroparesis. And a lot of them, when you stop the drug, the gastroparesis stays. This is a problem, a big problem. And there are now class action lawsuits against Novo Nordisk because of gastroparesis. And by the way,
Mm.
gastroparesis isn't listed on the label, on the warning label. So this is a big problem. Second problem, you lose weight. What's that weight? Well, it's both muscle and fat. Now, losing fat is good, but losing muscle is not. Ask any little old lady who breaks her hip whether she
Yeah.
wishes she had a little bit more muscle. In fact, the loss of muscle is associated with increased mortality. Sarcopenia is one of the hallmarks of increased risk for mortality.
Mm.
And, you're losing muscle as well as fat. Well, what else causes loss of muscle and fat? Starvation. Well, that's why it works, because you're starving, because you can't eat. So that makes sense, unfortunately, but not in a good way. And then finally, if you only 1/3 of the patients who take these drugs actually lose weight, and 1/3 of the people who take it end up stopping after a month. And whatever weight they lost, it comes roaring back because you actually haven't fixed the problem. You've band-aided it. So that's a
Mm.
problem too. So, there are some downsides to these medicines which people are not talking about. And then finally, my third hat, the public health hat. So these medicines will induce anywhere between 16 and 20% weight loss. Okay, that's
Mhm.
good. It costs $1,300 a month. Now, if everyone in America who qualified for a GLP-1 analog got it, that would be 2.1 trillion to the healthcare system for 16 to 20% weight loss. That's a big number. When you consider
Yeah.
that the healthcare budget is 4.1 trillion, 2.1 trillion is a greater than 50% surcharge on top of what we're already paying, and we can't even afford that. Conversely, and this is the important part, if we just got added sugar consumption in this country down to USDA guidelines, we could have a 29% weight loss, not a 16 to 20, but a 29% weight loss. And instead of costing 2.1 trillion, we could save 3.0 trillion. So that's a $5.1 trillion swing for better weight loss and no side effects. So which one makes more sense to you?
Yeah. So why do you suppose it's not done? Is
Oh,
is
why do
is
you
it
think? Oh, that's easy.
so is it the food industry and the amount of money they make?
There you go.
Hmm.
I have
Crazy.
nothing else to say. It's
Yeah.
self-explanatory.
So I want to come back to that, but I want to ask another question because I read a little bit about this in some of your writing. I want to talk about sugar and ADHD, the attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. What is the mechanism by which sugar impacts our ability to focus? And is it linked to ADHD?
Well, this is a complicated question. My
Mm.
colleague in London, Dr. Rachel Gow, is an expert on this and has written a book called Smart Foods for ADHD. And the very first thing you have to do to reduce ADHD is get rid of the sugar. And
Mm.
we sort of know why this is. I mean, basically, do you have kids?
Yes, three.
Okay, well, then they go to school and there are birthday parties, and the
Yeah.
birthday parties have cupcakes. and the kids eat the cupcakes and then they're bouncing off walls. And that is the end of the lesson. So the teachers have all learned that the cupcakes come out at the end of the day, not in the middle of the day, because once the cupcakes come out, that's the end of the lesson. Right. Well, so what's happening there? That's, a phenomenon which we call the sugar high. And part of the reason that that happens is because that fructose inhibits CNS mitochondrial functioning. It's
Hmm.
depleting ATP. And that ATP is necessary for those inhibitory neurons to work. And so
Hmm.
they become stimulated. And so you basically get hyperactivity, at least for for a period of time until the effect goes away and that you basically make new mitochondria. So we think we understand the mechanism. Um, it's a problem. It's a problem. Now, what's interesting is, there are a lot of obese kids. Do you ever see a sugar high in an obese kid? Never. That's because
Hmm.
their mitochondria are already depleted.
Hmm. Interesting. It's funny, as we were growing up, my father used to take any bottle of any soda that was in the house and throw it down the sink.
Well,
He didn't want us to
he was
drink it.
smart. He was smart.
Anyway,
So
I
this is a problem, and people don't understand it. People don't see why sugar is any different from any other calorie. But in fact, it is
it is.
because it has these effects on the mitochondria that are very different from other foodstuffs. And the food industry and pharma really don't want you to know that. And that's, one of the reasons I wrote books, and trying to get this information out to the public so that they can prepare themselves and arm themselves appropriately.
You mentioned that lower income communities are disproportionately impacted by this nutrition problem. And I'm wondering if, as a step towards addressing the issue, and I know this deviates a little bit from our primary conversation on nutrition, but why not prohibit the purchase of any carbonated beverage or anything labeled as a drink or a beverage for that matter, if you're using food stamps to make the purchase? In other words,
Boy,
if it does not provide a certain amount of nutrition, you can't pay for it with food stamps.
well, that's a really good question. And you may or may not know that I testified at a congressional hearing in the House of Representatives on May 22nd of this year. It was the
Mm, I didn't know that.
Agriculture Subcommittee of the House Appropriations Committee, and it was on exactly that, whether or not we can get soda off SNAP for just that reason. And it was
Hmm.
called by the chair of the Agriculture Subcommittee. His name is Andy Harris, and he is a congressman from Maryland 1, so from Baltimore. And
Hmm.
he is Republican. Uh, he is a former critical care physician anesthesiologist from Hopkins. And he knows, he understands. He's been there. He gets it. He understands the biochemistry. And so he called this meeting specifically to, investigate whether or not we could get soda off SNAP.
And can we?
No, we can't. And the reason we can't is because people, number one, think it's about calories, not because, sugar is a specific mitochondrial toxin. That's the first reason. So why would you, penalize people for consuming sugar if it's just calories? And number two, the Democrats on the committee were almost uniquely lined up against this measure because they think, well, if you take away soda, then they'll be taking away all of SNAP soon, you know. And so their job is to basically keep SNAP the way it is. And the argument they use is that, taking soda away from SNAP recipients is regressive against the poor. And I'll tell you what's more regressive against the poor. Diabetes is more regressive against the poor. So the goal is not to take away soda from SNAP. The goal is to take away soda from SNAP and use that money that is saved to actually subsidize the healthy foods.
Yeah.
Okay, so that, or vitamins and supplements that are not currently on SNAP, so that people could get better.
Mm.
But, the Democrats on the committee were absolutely adamant against it, and they didn't want to hear our testimony. They actually had, 5-minute monologues, and then they left. And it was remarkable. I was really quite nonplussed as to their actions and their statements.
Okay, more work to be done there.
Way more
So
work.
when I want to take a step back and, since we're talking about this, address the larger picture. Is it dangerous to look at just one ingredient? I recall at some point it was decided that there was too much sodium in the food, and I'm sure for very good reasons. And suddenly there was a slew of low sodium products on the shelves. Then there was something about fats, and we have a whole bunch of low fat versions of products. I'm wondering
Yeah.
if someone is going to come along and say, okay, let's take out the sugar and add something else, potentially equally or more harmful. So rather
Well,
than
we already got that.
regulating one ingredient at a time, I feel like the ground rules should be more robust when it comes to something as fundamental as nutrition. What are your
Well,
thoughts about that?
no, it's a very good point. It's a very good point. And it is true that every time we've targeted one specific foodstuff, what's happened is we've created a different monster. So we try to slay one and we create another. And I agree with that. We're all told to go low fat, and that's how we got into this mess. So low salt is a complicated one, but let me try to explain salt to you. Okay. Do we consume too much salt? Sure. But you know what? Our ancestors consumed too much salt also. In fact, they consume more salt than we do. And they didn't have this hypertension problem. Think of it this way.
Mm.
Before refrigeration, so
Yeah.
back in the 1800s, early 1900s, because refrigeration is an invention of around 1920, okay? Schooners would go out into the Atlantic to catch fish, you know, Atlantic salmon or cod or whatever. Okay. And they would go out for months at a time. It's not like they went out, putt-putted around and came back same day. Okay.
Hmm.
They went out for, months at a time. And they would catch the fish, but the fish would go rotten if they didn't have a way of preserving it. But they hadn't invented refrigeration yet. So how did they preserve the
Salt.
fish? They salt packed them.
Yeah,
They
salt.
packed
Yeah.
them in salt.
Hmm.
Okay. And that
Hmm.
preserved the fish. Okay. Well, so the fish took on that salt. So our ancestors were consuming 15 grams of salt per day, and they didn't have hypertension. And the reason they didn't have hypertension was because our kidneys were very adept at getting rid of the extra salt. Today, we are consuming on average 6.9 grams of salt per day. So we are consuming 60% less salt than our ancestors did. But we have a huge problem with hypertension.
Yeah.
And the reason is because our kidneys are not getting rid of the extra salt. They used to, and now they don't. If our kidneys could get rid of the salt wouldn't be a problem. It's only because the kidneys aren't getting rid of the salt that we have a problem. Okay, so why aren't the kidneys getting rid of the salt?
Mm.
Answer, one word,
Sugar?
insulin.
Oh, insulin. Mm.
The hormone insulin causes sodium reabsorption at the level of the kidney. And we are all now hyperinsulinemic and insulin resistant as part of our metabolic syndrome. And so, because we're hyperinsulinemic, that amount of salt that we're consuming now is too much for our kidneys because the insulin's actually causing the salt to be resorbed. So the question is, could we get the insulin down? The answer is, how do you get the insulin down? Get rid of the sugar. Turns out when you actually look at the meta-analyses, reduction in sugar actually has a bigger role to play in terms of blood pressure reduction than salt reduction does.
That's very interesting. I don't think people know that.
Well, I know. That's why I got a job.
Got a lot of work to do there. Huh.
Well, I'm doing my best. I will be very honest with you. I just this past weekend had to basically bitch slap a colleague on this exact issue. I won't
Hmm.
mention who it was, but it was pretty vociferous. It was private, but it was yeah. I made it very clear to this colleague, that this colleague was part of the problem, not part of the solution.
Well, it's interesting because that exacerbates the issue. If we have, for lack of a better term, people of authority in the field conflating the information or misinformation, dare I say, then it becomes very difficult for consumers to know what is right, what is wrong, what should I follow.
I
So,
completely agree.
mm,
It's a big problem. And, it's even made more of a problem in this post-truth world. Who do you believe?
yeah,
And, I get it. I've watched the, the House of Cards cave over these last 10 years, and it's very disconcerting. And there are people who don't believe me, and all I can say is
yeah,
I got the science, and, I'll put my science up against anybody else's. Now, if you don't want to believe science, that's, and we have a lot of people who don't want to believe science right now.
yeah.
That's a problem. It's a problem.
So I want to ask you a question, given that you've researched and written extensively about this topic for many years.
Yeah.
If you were given the power and the means to make a change that would permanently impact consumer nutrition, what change would you make?
I've said this before.
Mm,
The one, if I could ma wave a magic wand and have it stick,
mm-hmm,
okay,
mm-hmm.
what I would do is I would get rid of all food subsidies, every single
Mm.
one, all food subsidies, because food subsidies
Why?
distort the market. Let the market work. Even the libertarians can get on board with that.
Mm.
Fact of the matter is, we have a very screwed up food system because of subsidies, because, the ultra processed food um, producers are basically paid more to provide us with junk.
So the idea is you subsidize that, therefore they produce more of it because they make more money, and then you can't get
Right.
rid of it.
And
Mm,
so if we got rid of that, then the food would get better. Because the food industry, the one thing I'm very sure of is they don't care what they sell, just as
mm,
long as they sell. It's the
hmm.
only thing they care about. It's only about the money. They've told me so. They've said
Their business,
direct to my
basically.
face, direct to my
Mm,
face. They said, look, we can change. We've had to change before. We had to change when we were told to go low fat. We can change again with two provisos. We won't go it alone and we can't lose money. So
interesting.
if we got rid of subsidies, they wouldn't go it alone and they wouldn't lose money. So people say, oh, yeah, but the price of food would go up. Actually, it would not. So the Giannini Foundation at UC Berkeley, many years ago now, did a modeling analysis asking that exact question. What if we got rid of all food subsidies? Has to be all of them. Okay. And it turns out the price of food would not change, except for two items, which would go up: corn and sugar. And those are the two we
Interesting.
want to go up because then that would reduce effective availability. And so that would bring sugar consumption down without actually causing a crazy roller coaster in terms of the price of food. So that's what I would do.
Hmm.
That's what I would do. But
Okay, we'll have to come back
unfortunately,
to that. I want
unfortunately,
to,
that's going to require, Congress because that's the farm bill. And, it's not like I can do that by fiat or anyone can do that by fiat.
right. So it's interesting because I think humans have an innate desire for autonomy and the illusion of choice control. It seems to me that the
Well, it's
context
just an illusion.
shape. Well, because the context shapes our preferences, which allows for marketers, policymakers to influence our decision, right? By shaping the context in which we're given such options. So I noticed that you talk about this idea of marketing and propaganda in your Hacking of the American Mind book. My question is, do you think that we as consumers have a certain amount of responsibility to educate ourselves, to attempt to understand what the context of our choices are and learn how maybe we can become part of the solution and not being
Well, of course I do. Absolutely, I do. Why do you think I
Mm.
write books? Is to empower the consumer to do exactly that. And some do, and some don't, and some can't. And the question is, the some who don't and the some who can't, what are they going to do? They still need help. They're still
Yeah.
part of the system. They're still what's driving healthcare costs through the roof. So, you know, saying to the public, you're on your own, educate yourself, and good luck with that. That just doesn't really work. This is a
Mm.
public health problem and it needs a public health solution, right? Yes,
Right.
education comes first. I totally agree. That's why I write books. That's why I'm doing this podcast with you, because education comes first. But education alone has never solved any substance of abuse. Did Nancy Reagan's just say no work?
No.
Okay, we have a fentanyl crisis. Okay, bottom line, you can't fix the environment alone. You can't. It's got to be a societal phenomenon. So
Yeah.
you can't levy this on the individual and say this is personal responsibility. You
Yeah,
can't.
no, I agree with that. I don't think it's personal responsibility. I do think that um, providing the things such as what you provide and maybe these podcasts and things like that so that people can get the information is
Well,
very helpful. But
more people who understand, more votes, more politicians, who will do the right
mm,
thing. Because ultimately politicians lead from behind. There has to be more votes than dollars. And so you got to educate the public to get those votes.
yeah. So I want to ask you the four C's. You described the road to contentment as the four C's. Can you tell our listeners what are the four C's that will lead to a happier, healthier life, and what is the supporting science behind it?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, that's a mouthful right there. So in my book, The Hacking of the American Mind, I talk about two biochemicals, dopamine and serotonin. Okay. Dopamine is the pleasure neurotransmitter. Serotonin is the happiness or contentment neurotransmitter. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter that says, this feels good, I want more. Serotonin is the neurotransmitter that says, this feels good, I don't want or need anymore. They are not the same, clearly. All right. Well, dopamine drives addiction. Serotonin drives happiness. Everyone wants to be happy. Well, but we have a dopamine fueled society. Virtually everything in the store is designed to up your dopamine, also up your cortisol, in terms of fear, and down your serotonin. So the question is, how do you down your dopamine, up your serotonin, and down your cortisol? That's the question. And it turns out you can't buy those things. Those things are God-given. And we've been using them for thousands of years. But in the last 50, they've gone by the wayside. And we have to basically resurrect them. And so in the book, I call them the four C's. And they're all things your mother taught you, but you forgot, while sipping Coca-Cola and, or a Starbucks Frappuccino. So the first C is connect. And connect does not mean on Facebook. Connect means eye to eye connection, not even what you and I are doing right now.
Yeah.
Okay, but eye to eye. And the reason is because you are taking in my face, and it is being interpreted by a set of neurons in the back of your brain, okay, in the occipital lobe, called mirror neurons. And those mirror neurons are directly linked to the dorsal raphe, which generates the serotonin. So you're talking to me in person, not online, not what we're doing now, but in person would be a serotonin generator by itself. Relationships, connection. Okay. So that's the first thing. Number two, contribute. And that does not mean to your 401k. It means to others. Okay.
Mm.
Habitat for Humanity, or, education, or, whatever. Okay. Giving of yourself to others. Okay. That turns out to be a huge serotonin generator. Right? And it is not about money. It's never about money. Okay. Giving is a serotonin generator. Taking is not.
Mm.
Number three, cope is the third C. Okay. And cope means basically mindfulness, exercise, and sleep. And all of those reduce cortisol. And cortisol downregulates the serotonin receptor. So if you have fewer receptors, you basically get less happiness.
Mm.
So you got to basically mindfulness, exercise, sleep. And then the fourth C is cook. Because there are three things in the food supply that, basically alter dopamine, cortisol, and serotonin. Okay, so number one, tryptophan. Tryptophan is the precursor to serotonin. Okay, and it's in animal products. It's not in plant products. So that's a problem. Number two, get rid of the sugar, because the sugar, the fructose, is, the biggest dopamine driver. And then we need omega-3s. Omega-3s basically calm the brain and keep your cortisol much lower. So you need a high tryptophan, low sugar, high omega-3 diet. Oh, by the way, you have to reduce inflammation. And how do you do that? Well, what's causing the inflammation? Well, a lot of it's emulsifiers, because ultra-processed food is just rife with emulsifiers, okay, to hold the
Mm.
fat and water together, like when you put it in the microwave so it doesn't layer out. So it's real food. Real food is all four of those things. It's higher in tryptophan, it's lower in sugar, it's higher in omega-3s, and it's lower in emulsifiers. Eat real food.
And
Ultra
that's what you
processed
cook.
food's the problem. And that means cook. Yeah.
So we're coming to the hour and I need to close. And we have a tradition on our podcast where we ask our guests to provide our listeners with actionable advice that they can do today or tomorrow. And normally it's just one question, but for you, I have two. So the questions for you are, first, given that most people don't have 2 hours to spend at the grocery store trying to figure out what ingredients are in each item that they pick up, and I think you've mentioned some of this just now, but what do you recommend they do to maximize that potential of purchasing the nutritious food,
Right.
the ones you mentioned, when they're out shopping?
Right.
And
I can.
the second question is, since you work with adolescents,
Mm.
how can they begin to have a more active role in their nutrition, and what can parents do to support that?
Yeah. All right. So let's do the first one first. I am the chief medical officer of a company called Perfect, Perffact. You can
Mhm.
find it online at perfect.co, not com, co, perfect.co. And what this is it's a recommendation engine. It will go to your grocery store, okay, and you will put into Perfect what your biochemical profile is. So whether, for instance, you're trying to avoid sugar, or whether you're, trying to deal with metabolic syndrome, or whether you're gluten-free, or whether you have gout, or, hypertension, or anything else, okay, with a set of filters. And what it will do is it will remove from your grocery store all the foods that are bad for you and only let you see the foods that are good for you. And then you can purchase them online that way,
Mhm.
so that you basically you know, cull down the grocery store to that portion that's just good for you. And different people will have different needs or desires. And so
Right.
you can basically shop without even walking into your grocery store and buy the things that are good for you. So that's one way to do it. And I think it's a very valuable way. We've already shown that this has, major benefits, and we're trying to get this out to the world. So that's number one. Number two, adolescents. How do we get adolescents to understand this? Well, they're starting to understand this themselves. They are. The biggest problem, of course, is the media basically pelting them with junk, nonstop. And, this is a huge problem. And how do you deal with that? Well, first of all, we need nutrition education in schools. And we're doing that, but not everyone's doing that. We actually have a curriculum for, teaching even second graders nutrition and working all the way up, graded all the way up to 12th grade, because kids don't know what food is. They don't even know where it comes from. So there's a curriculum that's necessary. You have to teach this, and you have to teach it early and let the kids live it and taste it. The other thing is we have to get real food into schools. So I am the chief science officer of a nonprofit here in the Bay Area called Eat Real. You can find it online at eatreal.org. And what we do is we provide business models to food service professionals in school districts to be able to bring real food into K to 12 all over the country. Currently, we have 614 schools in 10 states. This next year, we will be expanding to 20 states. And our goal is to make this a model for food procurement, distribution, and consumption in every school in America. Because after all, what is the biggest fast food franchise in America? Our nation's public schools. If we could
Yeah.
get real food into schools, we would be able to turn this, childhood obesity epidemic on its head. And so there are school farms now, okay, and they're learning culinary skills inside the school, in the cafeteria. These are all things that help educate the next generation in ways that are valuable. And then the kid comes home and the mother takes the kid to the grocery store. And the kid says, "Hey, there's an artichoke. Can we have that for dinner?" And the mom says, "Well, I don't know how to prepare an artichoke." And the kid says, "Yeah, but I do." And then it becomes the positive disruptive force in the household. So you can
Hmm.
basically turn the whole thing over that way. All right. Um, but the other thing that you have to do is we have to get all of this drivel off social media, especially around food. I mean, it's a problem every which way, but especially around food, because that's where kids learn nutrition. And of course, they're not learning nutrition, they're learning how to be propagandized.
And on that note, I thank you very much for your time. This has been an extremely enlightening conversation. And thank you to all our listeners for tuning in. We hope you learned something new today, and we'll see you again next time. As we close, I want to thank you for joining me on the Her Notebook podcast. I hope today's conversation brought you some knowledge and sparked new insights. If you enjoyed this episode, I humbly ask that you please remember to click the subscribe button below. Until next time, keep flipping your notebook pages and embrace the journey to a healthier, happier you. See you next week.